men as she explores the realms of possibilities, hopes, and aspirations of the contemporary Muslim woman.
Assalamu alaikum. You are listening to Islam Today on WURD 900 AM, 96.1 FM. I am your host, Dr. Camila Rashad. I am the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation and also the founding co-director of the Black Muslim COVID Coalition. It's a collaboration between Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative and Muslim Wellness Foundation. And it was launched in March of this year in response to the global pandemic to ensure that our Black Muslim communities in the U.S. were fully informed and had the education and the resources necessary to just kind of keep abreast with the daily changes, the expectations, the demands. And we are now at a point where folks are thinking about what a phased reopening, what the fall is going to look like. There are many, many conversations about school reopenings, daycare, childcare. What is it going to mean? Especially, again, for those who are essential workers who have continued to work almost daily through this pandemic. And we have a lot of decisions to make, and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. We are all really thinking through as diligently and responsibly as possible what it means for us to educate our children, to go back to work. There have been many conversations as well about even the division of labor at home, right? What does it mean for folks to be at home and also managing children? Summer camp is really not a thing right now, and we're at the end of July, and so I'm wondering, it's like I'm sending all positive thoughts to those parents with children who are cooped up in the house, and now they actually don't want to be on their screens. They want to be kind of out and with their friends. And so every single day it feels like we're making really, really tough decisions, in the midst of so much uncertainty. And for that, I always pray to God that He provides the support and guidance and the patience and the strength to everyone who's making these decisions, oftentimes under duress, and for some of us with not enough resources, and we're trying to do the best we can. And so with that, I'll say I hope, are learning how to be self-compassionate, how to ask for help, how to seek out the support that we need, because this is absolutely a time in which we cannot kind of go it alone. We can't be stoic and say, I got this, I'll be fine, I don't want to be a burden to anyone. But to the best of our ability, while staying safe, we have to remain connected as a community. So my topic today, if you're just tuning in, this is Islam Today Radio on WURD 900 AM, 96.1 FM, and I'm your host, Dr. Camila Rashad. And I have on with me two really great guests, part of a team, Muslim Wellness Foundation, in collaboration with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the Black Muslim COVID Coalition, launched a Black COVID survey, a research project at the beginning of May, and it was really designed to find out more about what this pandemic, how it's affecting Black Muslim communities, Black communities generally, but specifically looking at how it's impacting Black communities, Black Muslim communities across the U.S., because what we were also finding is that a lot of the attention that was being paid to the disparities we were seeing in the African American community did not account for the religious diversity of our community. So there were partnerships with churches, there were conversations about how faith, and specifically Christianity, is sort of an anchor historically and presently for Black communities. But what we do know, and in particular in cities like Philadelphia, that we are also a very religiously diverse community with a very large community of Black Muslims here in Philadelphia and across the region, and in other cities like Chicago and Detroit, where we were also seeing, spikes and surges in cases that were disproportionately affecting us. And so what we were curious to know, and we thought it was really crucial to find out, is how is it impacting Black communities in the United States, with attention being paid to those who might be uniquely vulnerable, again, because of being a religious minority. So to my knowledge, this is the only survey to purposefully and thoughtfully work to engage and understand the lived experiences of Black Muslims during this global crisis in the U.S., particularly. The survey was anonymous, it was confidential, and it was really geared towards understanding the psychological, emotional, economic, and community impact of the pandemic. And we wanted to really find out, how is this impacting your work? How are you coping? How is this impacting your religious practice? And so I, along with, a really fantastic team, were able to, take this 4 or 5 week time period and recruit, those who self-identified as Black, and about a third of those did indeed identify as Muslim. So I have on the show with me today two of my colleagues who have been, part of the recruitment process, and then taking a look at what we've discovered through this survey. So Dr. Sean Bediako is a tenured faculty member in the Department of Psychology who studies psychological, social, and policy aspects of community health and well-being. His primary area of research examines the clinical implications of sickle cell disease stigma. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute of the National Institutes of Health. He teaches courses in research methods, social psychology, health psychology, and developed a seminar in race, science, and society for the renowned Meyerhoff Scholars Program and the UMBC Honors College. Dr. Bediako formerly chaired the UMBC Research and Creative Achievement Council and was also Associate Chair of the Department of Psychology. He is also the founder and principal of Straight Path Strategies, LLC. So he'll tell us a bit more about that work as well. He received his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Central Arkansas and completed a master's degree in community psychology from Florida A&M. After earning a master's degree in psychology and a doctorate in social health psychology from Stony Brook, he was a postdoctoral fellow for faculty diversity at UNC. He is currently, because he doesn't have enough degrees, Dr. Bediako, I'm kidding, he is currently pursuing a master's in public administration from the University of Baltimore. So welcome to Islam Today, Dr. Bediako.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Rashad.
Wa alaikum salam. And so we will also be joined by someone who's been a guest on the show before. He is also a team member of Black Muslim COVID Coalition. He is on the planning committee of the Black Muslim Psychology Conference. So I also want to welcome Imam Abdulmalik Merchant. He is currently the Muslim chaplain at Tufts University and also chaplain at Essex County Jail in Massachusetts. In this role as chaplain, he offers mentorship and support to students across Tufts University. He's a support to staff and faculty, and I know there's, even more so now, kind of given the uncertainty around what school and campus will look like. He is, very, very busy, so I'm grateful that he's taking the time to be on with us today. He has completed a Master's of Theological Studies at Boston University's School of Psychology, specializing in practical theology. He is definitely, we're just going to put that out there. We're going to be as supportive as possible. Planning to pursue a PhD in social work with a focus on the decolonization of Islamic spiritual practice and wellness. So I have two amazing guests, y'all. So welcome to the show, Imam Abdulmalik.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum salam.
So, I want to get right to this data, the responses from Black Muslims specifically, and what does it mean for what we should be thinking about moving forward, right, just to understand the experience on Black Muslims, that this is, I said, to my knowledge, the only survey that really sought to engage the Black Muslim community to understand at this time, what does it mean to be both a racial and religious minority during a time of a global pandemic, during a time of, much political and social unrest. This is a presidential election year. It's a census year. And so there's a lot at stake. So to understand how this is impacting Black Muslims, I think, is really critical. And in particular, like I said, in those cities where there's, a large community of Black Muslims that are, involved in many different ways in, what is happening in this present moment. So first, I want to turn to you, Dr. Bediako, to share with our listeners kind of an overview of who our participants were, some of the major findings that we discovered, and, some of the conversation that we've been having about what this means.
Okay, thank you, Jazakallah. I really want to, again, thank you for having me on the program, for including me in the program. It's really an honor to be here. As you mentioned in, your introductory comments, this is perhaps kind of a novel and unique data set, if you will. Although I think we have to be very conservative with respect to how we look at inferences from the data in terms of what it means. It's rich with respect to what it's describing. And I think the narrative that's going to emerge from it is one of the things that we will want to focus on. For this particular project, as you mentioned, data was collected between May 6th and June 11th or June 14th, I believe. And there were about 845 respondents. About 311 of those respondents indicated and self-identified that they were Muslim. On average, folks were about 39 years old, with a range of from 17 to people who were logging in and indicated that they were 82. So one of the things that I think also is important to note is that the Black Muslim respondents represented a broad diversity of Black Muslims. So about 2/3 of the sample were identified as Black American Muslim, but about 1/3 also indicated that they were Black African. And I think, that's also not in terms of like how do we figure out ways to further divide our communities, but in thinking about giving voice to as broad a range and diverse a range of Black Muslims. I think this data set sort of speaks to those things. About 3/4 of the sample were female. And, so, I mean, we can go into some of the major things that kind of emanated from the data set, but one thing that I will say as an overall comment on it is I think what it really talks about is the notion that timing is everything. And I think that as we'll kind of go into a little bit more, during this time in early May through mid-June, it overlapped with Ramadan. And so, the context, I believe, shaped a lot of the responses that people had. So one of the things that I think comes out of this is this idea that, and especially as we think about how the pandemic itself, it's clear at this point now that we're in it for the long haul. And so we're having to make a shift from being in crisis response mode to really thinking about what's the developmental trajectory for this. And so how do we, cope and adapt to this in a dynamic fashion? And so those are some of the things that I think, will underscore almost everything that comes out of this data set.
Right. And just for the benefit of our listeners and those who, not as well versed in sort of research methods and, significance and inference, how or why, or how would you describe how significant this is that, one, the number of participants that we were able to recruit, and that 1/3 or more, even 1/3 of the respondents were Muslim? How is this unique?
Well, it's unique in the sense that, most people who do these types of surveys have a lot of resources and particularly financial resources behind them. So they're able to pay participants. They're able to provide incentives. And for this is just basically, I mean, I don't think it's an understatement to say that it's a labor of love, that it was a labor of connecting and networking with people, and the call went out to the community, and folks in the community responded. Mm-hmm. I'm sure the response could have been even stronger and could have been even greater, but the response is not insignificant to begin with. Mm-hmm. As you said, I doubt that there are very few studies that have been conducted since, and there are a plethora of those since the pandemic has initiated, but I don't think that there's many that can say that they have 300 self-identified Black Muslims who are part of that sample. Mm-hmm. So that in and of itself, I think, is a tremendous point to emphasize. But just in terms of like thinking about what that means with respect to the broader, like from a methodological perspective, that allows us to kind of really think about having a representative sample of folks.
Right. Right. And, you mentioned that, in terms of sort of ethnic diversity, one of the comments that I think one of the participants made was this was one of the first surveys, if not the only, that because it was designed to capture the experiences of Black folks in the U.S., that there were so many, we asked, questions about ethnicity, but then how do you describe yourself? And this participant said, it was really affirming, right, mm-hmm. to then complete a survey that didn't just have, okay, so do you identify as Black or African American, mm-hmm. right? But also trying to capture, that this is truly kind of a diasporic community where we have those who identify as Afro-Arab, Afro-Latinx, Caribbean background, Black African. And I think, what is also important, perhaps to mention here, is how folks are identifying religiously. So could you say a little bit about that?
Right. So there were questions in it. So let me back up. Before I go to that, I will say that a lot of that, and I know it's not your intentions, but I can laud your virtues all day, because a lot of this would not have been possible without the strong leadership that you showed in doing this. And I'll be the first to confess that as a quote-unquote professional researcher, there were some approaches that I was like, nah, that's just not pragmatic. That's not going to work. But, when you explain the rationale behind it, and then I also had to humble myself a little bit I would say a lot, to think about the fact that I couldn't approach this project as business as usual as I do with the other ones. Mm-hmm. Being a Muslim myself, and this was like one of the rare opportunities that I had to sort of combine, my faith with my professional expertise. Mm-hmm. And so I really had that opportunity, and I'm grateful for that you gave me, to be able to understand more, despite decades of experience in doing this type of work, in doing survey methodology and survey research. What you just spoke to, I think, is the underlying aspect here, that the survey itself asked questions that allowed people to, really, because there was a number of open-ended questions, it allowed people to lend their voice to the data and not just a response to the data. Mm-hmm. So I think that piece, was very... that was a wonderful approach on your part, but I also think that it really made for why we got the type of response that we did in such a short period of time. Mm-hmm. Now, with respect to the second question that you asked about the diversity of it, like, we asked people to kind of talk more about their religious identity and gave people options with respect to how they responded. So about 64% of the respondents identified with Sunni Islam, and about 3.2% identified as Shia. And there was about a 10% of respondents who identified as Sufi. But we also, kind of opened it up and this really represented, again, the diversity of the Black Muslim community. There were people who identified with the Nation of Islam as being their primary religious identity, with the community of W.D. Muhammad, and then there were about 10% of people, almost 11% of people who didn't identify with any particular community. So we also asked questions about folks who were born into Muslim families and people who were converts. And then the question I love the most about whether or not people were unmosqued, would they consider themselves unmosqued or not. We had a number of folks who, indicated that they were not actively engaged or I guess had a identifiable religious home within a particular mosque. Right.
Yeah, and as you describe it, I'm really struck by, again, how this offers, I think, even those who are specifically studying the impact of COVID on Black communities, such, I think kind of an eye-opening look at how rich and diverse and deep our communities are, those who identify as Black Muslims, because we tend to sort of be flattened in the media. We're invisible within, kind of the larger American Muslim faith community at many times. Folks don't really know what we look like.
Right.
And so to be able to have, I think, this data that is really rich in terms of, how people are self-describing, how they're describing their experiences, and also how integral sort of faith is to their understanding of themselves. I think it's like, I don't know, something about that strikes me as just very groundbreaking. I don't want to sound dramatic or kind of use hyperbole here, but I just haven't seen it. And now that we have this information, it feels like it gives us really a stronger platform to really push for more diversity, even within the conversation around sort of Black research. Right, and what that means.
For sure. This definitely opens up the narrative to include a broader range of voices, for sure.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Islam Today Radio on WURD 900 AM, 96.1 FM. I'm your host, Dr. Camila Rashad, and our focus today, our conversation, is looking at the data that we've collected from the Black COVID survey, and, sort of frame this conversation as day by day, leaning on faith. And this was, one of the frequent responses that we received to how people are coping. And my guests today are Dr. Sean Bediako, a psychology professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Imam Abdulmalik Merchant, who's a Muslim chaplain at Tufts University and Essex County Jail in Massachusetts. So, Imam Merchant, I want to pull you in also because I'm wondering if this sort of the religious and ethnic diversity of these respondents also offered you a bit more information that perhaps you had kind of anecdotal sort of experience with, and these numbers, right, this data then allowed for you to begin to really unpack some of the trends that you were seeing as an imam.
Yeah, for me it was incredibly unique. One, as Dr. Sean already mentioned, the sort of unique perspective that you bring to this and sort of uplift everyone else on the team to think sort of in a way that is appropriate for us. And so for me, either I'm looking at it from a theological perspective or a psychological perspective. And I knew that, there's a Pew study that says 69% of people see spirituality primarily outside the masjid. But from the spiritual impact, 50% of people responded that COVID impacted their ability to not go to the masjid. And that wasn't even looking at positive or negative, but half of the people, 5 out of 10 people said, how did COVID impact your religious experience? I couldn't go to the masjid. And that was really unique for me, which then made me figure out, okay, well, how is it, or made me think rather, how is this going to impact people's spiritualities? And if Pew is, their research is saying that 69% of people seek spirituality outside the masjid, then why are so many people also now impacted by not being able to go to the masjid. And obviously, Ramadan being in the middle of our data set, or when we're intaking data, had a big impact on that as well.
Right. And if you're listening and you have a question specifically about, how we recruited, what are some of the specific questions that you have, please feel free to call in at 215-634-8065 or toll free 866-361-0900. I do want to return to this question around religion and religious coping. But first I wanted to ask you again, Dr. Bediako, if you could also share with our listeners how people were impacted by the disease itself. How many Black Muslims were either exposed or sick or, had family members, because this was also an important part of what we discovered as well.
Right, and that's why I said at the outset that timing was everything. I know that these numbers probably shift, so we just have to keep in mind that this is one particular snapshot in time. But at the time of the survey responses that we initially got from early May to mid-June, the majority of the respondents were largely asymptomatic. So about 84% of our respondents indicated that they had not shown any symptoms of COVID. And about 13% had symptoms, but they had not been formally tested. And only 3 respondents out of the 311 that we had were currently diagnosed with COVID, and 6 at that time had said that they had been diagnosed, but that they had recovered. At the same time, so even though there's not it doesn't appear to be a lot of personal experience with it, at the time, a lot of the respondents indicated that they didn't have friends or family members who were currently diagnosed with COVID, but about half reported that they had friends or family members who had already recovered from it. At that time, and about 28% reported that they had friends or family members who had died as a result of COVID. And again, this was early on in the pandemic stages, so about 2 months in, we're seeing those types of numbers. So even though our respondents, and it may be a selection bias where people who respond to surveys are typically those who are most healthy, but about half of people, even though they didn't have friends or family members who were currently diagnosed with coronavirus at the time, that about a third said that they had friends or family members who had shown symptoms, and about half reported that they had folks in their network who had recovered from COVID. So the impact was still there, even though the personal experience of it seemed to not be at that time.
Right. And could you also just say a bit about, because we did ask a question about pre-existing health conditions, and we got a lot of responses to that, which was a bit concerning for me. Yes.
So, and that's just one of the things when we had some conversations about that. I wasn't that shocked about it, just being a health researcher and knowing just the stark inequities that exist among Black people in general in the United States. But about 47% of the Muslim respondents indicated that they had a pre-existing health condition. Now, one of the things is that when we asked what those health conditions were, that came up in the open-ended questions. So those are things that I haven't taken a close look at. And so I'm sure that for you or for Imam Merchant, who've looked at those, you could probably speak more to the types of things that people are mentioning, but they run the gamut from just my cursory glance at them. They run the gamut from, like relatively, I guess what I could call benign conditions to those that are quite serious. But having almost 50% of a convenient sample of people report that they have pre-existing conditions, again, I can see where that would be cause for alarm.
Absolutely. I don't know if Imam mentioned you had time to kind of take a look at those who, because we also asked questions about stress. So those who did indicate that they had a pre-existing condition, the level of stress, and then also how they were coping. And many were sort of using religious coping or really leaning into Ramadan as a source of sort of support and comfort. Is that what you were able to find?
Yeah, it was really unique, and it was just really unique that 44% of the people reported some sort of positive impact, whether it was increase in their practice, whether it was increase in spirituality or the faith or connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it was they shifted to a new type of practice. It seems that the Muslims who took this survey were able to grow with or lean into faith to find ways of coping and find ways of healing. Yeah. Whereas only 15% reported negative impact. And so they would say, like, the mosque is closed, but I found this, so this has been the best Ramadan ever for me. And that was really, really interesting.
And I wondered, too, about the, when you said for this, timing is everything, right? So relatively early, right, only 2 or 3 months into the pandemic, although we had to make some pretty dramatic shifts in, how people were going to worship, what did Ramadan look like, what did Eid al-Fitr look like. We're coming up on another Eid holiday in about a week or so. And so if you were sort of able to kind of summarize how people were coping using sort of religion as, a base of support, I'll put it that way, what were some of the themes that emerged from even those open-ended responses to how the pandemic was impacting their religious practice?
It was interesting because there was a whole array of people feeling many different ways, but because it was Ramadan, they were able to cope with their inability to go to the mosque by reading more, by engaging in dhikr, by remembrance and supplication and dua. And so people were able to use their theology and their belief in God as the coping mechanism in and of itself. And so they would quote scripture and Quran by saying, well, God doesn't burden us with more than we can bear, and so that's why this has happened. So I was able to find these different type of methods, or and different things along those lines. And they were leaning into their underlying and theological foundation to push forward and keep finding new ways.
Right. And so this is a question that I have for both of you, because I'm struggling with this. So I'm just going to kind of put it out there because it's been part of our ongoing conversation, is how do we balance, right, this, historically, right, when we think about how Black communities have coped with a number of challenges, right? What does suffering mean? How do we make meaning of, this unrest, right, presently and historically? How do we make sense of a pandemic, right, a global pandemic that is disproportionately infecting and killing us, right? And this is a symptom or a manifestation of the inequality, right? It's not a manifestation of that we're just more predisposed, right, to COVID. So how do we balance what we have seen expressed through religious coping? So I'm going to read some of the open-ended responses, and how encouraging it is to hear how people are expressing, right, how much they rely on faith in order to kind of understand these moments. And so I'll just read several. One, I'll have to say that frequently, even just through a glance, is taken, one of the comments is why I sort of frame this conversation like this day by day, right? So people said, I have my good days and I have my not so good days. I take one day at a time, day by day. Sometimes they're good, some days there aren't. I'm trying not to let the anxiety get the best of me. But what came through very clear was the identifying calling on the name of Allah, calling on, this Ramadan, this kind of deepening opportunity to deepen spiritual practice. So one participant said, I have faith and trust in Almighty God, and that whatever happens is by His will. I'm taking every day as it comes and praying more. Some days are overwhelming, but I'm going to take it day by day. I make Allah sufficient for all of my needs, and He supplies prayer, reading the Holy Quran, and family support, right, as part of that need. There were other comments, such as, I prayed and read the Holy Quran. I seek refuge in Allah, right? So these were statements that were repeated over and over again. Right. So on the one hand, this is not uncommon, right? We have, through our own experiences, through research, this is a foundation of how Black folks understand themselves in the world, right? Like, there is a higher power. There is a purpose, even if I don't know what it is, right? I trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One person said, I'm holding on to the rope of Allah. I'm fine. I accept the qadr of Allah. I accept His decree. I know that with every difficulty comes relief, right? I also pray regularly that I fear nothing but Him, right? So these were, profound, at least to me, very profound comments. So how do we balance that with comments that also indicate that we are in a lot of pain, right? That we are experiencing an increase in stress and anxiety, someone said feeling demoralized, feeling super scared, right? Quote, because I know everyone's death is pre-written and can't be avoided. At the same time, it is making me slightly anxious because I've barely gotten to experience life and I'm not super stoked about dying young. This was a comment from a participant. The one that really kind of captured, that really kind of just hit me, I think in my heart, was this one. Quote, I am doing my best to hold on to the light of faith. If I were not Muslim, if it wasn't the holy month of Ramadan, I can't tell you what my state would be. I have had a lot of dark days and have had difficulty coping. I can't sleep at night. Even when it's time to break fast, I can't eat a lot and have lost weight because of this. My mind is always racing, thinking about how brief this life is. Black death is prevalent still. Black abuses have escalated, and to be forced to stay home and not be able to do anything to fight back has made coping with this pandemic a heart-wrenching one. I am more angry than ever. I find myself moving towards feelings of apathy. This is the most terrifying consequence of this pandemic. To be indifferent about what is happening all over the globe in an effort to protect my sanity would be to sacrifice the softness of my heart, and that certainly cannot happen. But every day it feels like an inch closer to despair. To be Black in this time is to be beaten to a pulp with just enough life to keep our blood flowing. I don't know how much I can take before I lose my heart to the madness of the world. All this to say, overall, I'm coping terribly with bouts of, you know what, God, you got it, it's yours. So with all of the comments that, were really uplifting how important and significant and meaningful, right, it was to engage in the remembrance of Allah and to read, there was this, really profound statement that stood out to me. And so I guess I want to ask both of you, how do we balance, right, the obvious, or I don't want to say obvious, how do we balance the expression, right, of pain and anxiety, of stress, of feeling demoralized, with also this historical, present and, quite possibly, I'm certain, future reliance on faith as like a stabilizing force, right? I don't want to pathologize the coping, right. but I often feel like we gloss over also the expressions of pain and hurt that we also experience. I said a lot there, I know. But it was really I've been thinking about it ever since I read it. It was just really so eloquently kind of captured the complexity of what we're experiencing, and I wanted to share that.
So I'll say, because that's that's very complicated and it's very complex. And I think the range of responses that you just mentioned demonstrate the complexities of what people are thinking and how they're dealing with, how they're coping, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think that is kind of clear to me, because I'm not a clinician, and so I think that the psychological ways that people cope, one of the things that I'm encouraged by is the extent to which people seem to be using optimism as a psychological coping mechanism, and the extent to which that's grounded in faith. Like, I'm standing on the sidelines, like cheering, like, yeah, please keep that up. Yeah. As a behavioral scientist, though, I guess my thing is trying to think about, the faith element helps to shape the cognitive component. What I'm concerned about is especially from the last comment that you mentioned, is I think the answer to this question about how do we balance this is when we can understand what are the behavioral connections there, right? Because how people psychologically process these things can ebb and flow.
Sure.
Right? But I think what's important is, especially in this context of COVID, some of the behavioral things that we do can mean the difference between life and death. Absolutely. Not just for us, but for other people too. So if we're not practicing, effective social, I shouldn't call it social distancing, but physical distancing, if we're not, eating well for ourselves, if we're not taking care of underlying conditions we might have, we not only make ourselves more susceptible and vulnerable to, this virus, but, we also can have an impact on others who depend on us or others who we are connected to. So that shift in the mindset from loss to opportunity is something I think is informed by the dispositional optimism. But the behavioral components, I think that's where it behooves us to really think about, where is like our first aid warriors for our mental first aid warriors, because people need resources and services to where they can, have someone to just talk to and process these things out. Because the thing about this particular context that I think is very important is the fact to which it isolates people. Yes. And as the comments show, that isolation can be good if you're reading more Quran and engaging more in dhikr and kind of, strengthening your iman. But that isolation that same type of isolation can also work against you if you are like just kind of like floating on this ocean of emotions. So I don't know if I've answered that question. I don't even know that I can answer that question. But to me, those are the things. I think we need to figure out, how can we make sure that people have connections to folks that they can talk to and process these things through. And the extent to which that's done by mental health professionals, I think is a good thing, because that's one of the things from the data that about half of respondents had indicated that they had sought mental health counseling at some point in their lives, which I think is encouraging too.
Yes.
Right. So that's my take on that.
So you're going to kick it over to us, the mental health professionals.
Of course. You're the professionals.
You're
trained professionals.
No, I think that's very helpful. And I want to pull you in, Email Merchant, because this is what we've been working towards in terms of like the collaboration between the scientists, right, and the mental health professionals and the religious leaders, right? Because of this expressed complexity, it's not going to be one field or scholarly kind of pursuit that will offer, right, the supposed antidote. And so, Imam Merchant, I know that particularly during Ramadan, you were even busier than you normally are. And so I guess what kind of complexity was being sort of expressed to you, and whether or not even the statement that I made was similar to, how people were coming to you.
Yeah, I would have to agree with both of you all. I think that there needs to be some collaboration between religious leadership and mental health practitioners. And I say that because I personally, the thesis of my academic research is that our emotional well-being, that our spiritual states will be predicated, our spiritual and our practical, like how much we pray and et cetera, is predicated on our emotional well-being. Our emotional well-being are the secretive connective tissue between those two things. And so...
Wait, no. I'm gonna pause you right there. And I want you to say that again, and I want you to say it slower. Because that was important. He's like, now what did I say?
My thesis, no, I know this, alhamdulillah.
Okay, alhamdulillah.
The three categories of our tradition is that we have a practical aspect, the prayer, the fasting, Islam, and we have a theological aspect, the psychological, or theological, philosophical, what we believe in God, etc. And then we have a spiritual component. These are three major components that traditionally our scholars have always talked about. My thesis is that our emotional well-being is the figurative connective tissue between all of those. What I mean by that is our practice can be impacted by our emotional state. If I'm depressed, then I won't want to pray. And therefore, if I'm depressed, I can know who God is, and I still don't feel any connection. And if I'm depressed, then I won't want to engage in anything else. And a very real example that I've given people just to lower the waterline and be transparent is my own reality. As a student of knowledge, studying Islam in the most sacred place on earth, in Mecca, I had suicidal ideology.
Mashallah.
And so, again, I'm doing what theologically was one of the most sacred things to do. In Mecca, I was in one of the places that people will be going to any day now, driving to Mina, feeling that way. And I share my story because our emotions are very, very important. And so, specifically about COVID, I think that, or COVID and our emotional states in general, if our spirituality is producing healthy behaviors, so someone is dealing with this situation or stuck at home sleeping for on the dhikr, as Dr. Shah mentioned, then that's beautiful. But if our spirituality is only a spiritual bypass for how we're really doing, and we're not actually dealing with our reality, and I'm just using spirituality or theology to say, yes, God is the decree of all things, but I also now have loneliness, suicidal ideation, if I have anything, depression, anxiety, etc., the gambit of emotional experience that are not healthy or conducive to my well-being, then now I need to check because theology, therefore, is not doing its job.
Okay.
Religion is not doing its job. Our religion, we believe, is here to help us be the best version of ourselves, to be a way that's pleasing to God, and God wants us to be good. Because God says in the Quran, He wants ease for us and not difficulty.
Right. Right. I mean, I'd love just the way that you explained it. I don't think I've heard it explained so concisely and beautifully. And I think I'm hoping that there are those who are in positions of leadership, whether that be in community, religiously, educationally, that can begin to understand, one, why faith has been so foundational, right, to just kind of Black existence, and why we cannot neglect this sort of psychological, emotional, mental element, because the only sort of slight amendment I would make, just so for those who are listening who are kind of in this state right now, is that when we say, well, I won't want to pray, for those, it may be physically painful even just to move. Right, just the level of lethargy and, even kind of like self-hatred and kind of self-castigation may be such that they're just immobilized. And so even if their mind is saying, yes, I want to do this, like maybe physically, right, I cannot move. I can't even make ablution, right? I can't move from my bed to the bathroom in order to make wudu. And so I just wanted to kind of make that slight point, because I know that we have people who are listening who may be struggling in this moment, right? And then feeling, kind of a source of like religious shaming, right? Like I'm just a terrible Muslim, and this is probably why, right? I'm feeling lonely, right? This is why I'm feeling so isolated. Say that again?
Can I give an example?
Sure.
So I spoke with a sister today who is sexually abused, God protect you all, and all of us, and our family and loved ones, by the same person who taught her tradition, taught her Islam. So now, as an adult herself, with her own children, it sometimes is difficult for her to practice her tradition because there's a direct connection between her and her abuser. hijab, of a headscarf. If a woman is abused with her headscarf, then not wearing her headscarf could be an act of worship. Not wearing a headscarf could be a means of her getting closer to God, because either the headscarf or apostasy.
Right. Right. Wow.
So absolutely everything that you're saying, and we shouldn't spiritually shame anyone for that, because one, God knows our reality better than we know ourselves. And so if we actually are having challenges and difficulties, despite what anyone may think or feel, God knows, and God's merciful, and God's loving, God's compassionate. He doesn't want us to be in a difficult state.
Yes. Yes. I am so sad that we're getting to the end of the hour already, and we have to wrap up. We're going to continue this conversation, inshallah. We're going to have a full kind of webinar to help people understand the information, even as we begin to understand all of, what we have collected. But in, the final minute, I'll give to each of you 60 seconds. What I would say, what resonated or impacted or kind of captured you the most about just what we've collected, either the process or the content, right? What do you think impacted you the most?
Yeah.
Dr. Bediako, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, for me, I think it's the fact that, as indicated by the last conversation that we've had for the last couple of minutes, we're primarily having a grown folks conversation, if you will. And for me, one of the things that I think is very important is for us not to forget about our young people and how they are coping and adjusting to these things. And a lot of the spiritual issues that we talked about are not solely relegated to the adult population, right, but also may be issues that can help to avert spiritual crisis with our younger people, our adolescents and teenagers.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And for you, Imam Merchant?
If I'm going to be completely honest, the most impactful part of this survey was having the opportunity, one, to survey my people, our people, to also do it in an interdisciplinary way. That was like a watershed moment for me, to be able to study and look at and benefit from people who are not looking at what is typically done, but are going in unique ways to find the most authentic and the most applicable information. So one would be a big part of the team of both of you all, and then the authenticity, the generosity, the humility everyone that took the survey did in giving us this wonderful information.
Absolutely. I would have to agree with both of you that, as we continue to unpack this, that we also think about our young people and that we continue to push for research that is interdisciplinary, that we're challenging ourselves to kind of think outside of, our specific disciplines, because we're trying to understand whole people, right? Not just kind of portions of who they are. So inshallah, I'm really excited for the continuation of the work and what it might mean for our communities and, how beneficial potentially it could be. If you have been tuning in, hopefully we'll have a recording. I know there are moments that I want to, kind of listen back because I have, an amazing colleagues, and they're very thoughtful and sincere and committed to really doing this work so that our experiences are understood better, so that we can begin to first help ourselves and be more compassionate, but also then to advocate for the structural and policy changes that will be necessary to help alleviate our conditions. I'm your host, Dr. Camila Rashad. Thank you for joining us, and up next is Rick Ford and the Recovery Hour.
This message is from the Philadelphia Department